My name is Brian Ahrens and I'm recording this interview with Pablo Leighton on Friday the 10th of March 2023 in one of the rooms at the Marrickville Library in Sydney. I was born on the 6th of July 1945. I grew up in a communist family. I lived in variously Sydney, Adelaide, Newcastle and then back in Sydney. I went to school in the western suburbs of Sydney. I went to Sydney University where I did physics and maths. Later on I taught physics at the University of New South Wales. That was for about 8 or 9 years. Then I worked for the Communist Party of Australia for about 20 years and then I worked in the Commonwealth Public Service in Indigenous related areas, at that time Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, now more commonly referred to as First Nations peoples, and I worked there for about 20 years also as a communication director for the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, for Reconciliation Australia, a private body, and then for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission.
Okay, my first question, Brian, is that your family, parents, grandparents, they move all around Australia, from Perth, Newcastle, etc. But I know that your uncle Eric was born in 1919 in a Marrickville hospital, 17 months after Laurie. Well, they were both from Undercliff, next to the Inner West. So the simple question is, what were you told by your parents, and what do you know about how the Inner West was in the 20s, 30s, before pre-World War II, especially in terms of class and ethnicity? How was that?
Well, in all honesty, they didn't talk much about all of that, interestingly enough. As I was a kid growing up, I was aware of politics generally, obviously, around the dinner table at night. My father, Laurie, in fact, left school at the age of 14, although he was at Sydney Boys High. He could have gone on, as my uncle Eric did, I'm absolutely sure, to have got a university degree, but he left school at the age of 14 to become a professional revolutionary, quote unquote, and he used to, at that early age, address people in the Sydney Domain, which was a big place for public speaking, as it were. And I have an independent observation of that from an old guy where we lived out at Fairfield, one of the volunteers into the Spanish Civil War, one of the 37 or 38 volunteers that went to the Spanish Civil War. His name was Jim McNeil, and at a party, a CPA event in Fairfield, he spoke about seeing Laurie speak in the Domain, a kid in short pants speaking to these older workers. One comment that he did make about the inner city was, this is my father Laurie I'm still speaking of, in the 1930s, of course, there was a big unemployed workers movement, and especially in the inner cities where many working class people lived. Many of them were being evicted from houses because they couldn't pay the rent. But he described a meeting that he actually spoke at. The extreme right wing had a movement, I'll think of the name in a minute, and there was a big meeting that I think the party and the unemployed workers movement held out in Bondi, and he spoke at it, and he said, a very big meeting he spoke at, but most of the people there were against him because they were from this extreme right-wing movement. And, the other point to make is that in those days, the unemployed workers, communists and others, they couldn't even afford to go by transport. They would walk many miles to go to a meeting. So many of them had walked from this, inner west all the way out to Bondi, and later that night they were being attacked by the movement, the right-wing movement, and they waited until a whole lot of them had dropped off and then turned around and there was a big street fight. So this was very different days to the ones that we are in now. My grandfather, Sam Aarons, their father, had gone into the boot-making trade, and Laurie and Eric both learnt how to do boot-making and shoe repairs and so on. And they worked in a shop, but I don't know whether that was in the inner west, and I think my grandfather might have had more than one shop actually.
It was in Crystal Street near Parramatta Road, Petersham.
Yes, okay, right. Well, there you go. Certainly, they were growing up when this whole inner west was a very different place, very much working class suburbs, decades before so-called gentrification of these suburbs, where educated, middle class, even to some extent, some upper class people living in the area. They were very different places at that time.